I never wanted to take the case. It came to me by way of a desperate colleague, a psychiatrist who had seen one too many things he couldn't explain. He called me late one evening, voice trembling, asking if I could evaluate a patient. "There's something wrong with her," he said. "Something beyond medicine." I should have said no. The moment I stepped into that hospital room, the air changed. Thick, heavy, charged with something unseen but unmistakable. Julia sat on the hospital bed, wrists bruised from the restraints they'd placed on her after the last outburst. Her eyes, hollow, black wells, fixed on me the instant I entered. "You think you can help me, don't you?" she rasped, her voice layered with something that didn't belong in this world. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I turned to Dr. Carter, who had called me here. He stood frozen near the doorway, refusing to come closer. "We've run every test," he whispered. "Brain scans, psych, valuations, everything." His hands shook. "We shouldn't be able to hear voices coming from inside her when she's not speaking." I forced myself to look back at Julia. She smiled, a slow, deliberate stretch of her lips that showed too many teeth. "You should listen to them," she murmured, her head tilting to one side as if observing me like a specimen under glass. "They know what happens when people like you get too close." I stepped forward. The room felt colder. A shadow shifted in the corner, though nothing was there. "Who am I speaking to?" I asked, keeping my voice steady. Her grin widened. "Oh, doctor, I think you already know." Then the lights flickered. A violent tremor ran through the bed as the heart monitor let out a sharp, high-pitched wail. Julia's body convulsed, her back arching unnaturally as the restraints dug into her flesh. The overhead light burst with a loud pop. Glass rained down. Then, silence. Her body went limp, her breathing slow and measured. I turned to Carter, but he was already backing away, his face drained of color. Then Julia's voice returned. Clear, deliberate. "They're behind you." A rush of cold air shot down my spine. The room groaned as if the walls were breathing. I didn't dare turn around. I didn't turn around. Every fiber of my being screamed for me to run, but my feet remained planted. My breath came shallow, my pulse hammering against my ribs. Julia lay perfectly still, but her lips curled at the edges, as if she could see something I couldn't. Dr. Carter was gone. I hadn't heard him leave, hadn't seen him move. The only sound was the steady beeping of the heart monitor and the whispering that came from nowhere and everywhere at once. I swallowed hard and took a step toward the door, but then, bang, the door slammed shut. Julia exhaled a slow, rattling breath. "You're not alone in here." I reached for the door handle, but the metal burned against my palm. I jerked my hand away, watching in horror as deep red welts formed on my skin, as if something had gripped me from the other side. Then the overhead speaker crackled to life. It shouldn't have. This room wasn't hooked up to the hospital's intercom. The static morphed into distorted whispers, too layered to distinguish any words. I forced my gaze back to Julia. She wasn't on the bed anymore. The restraints hung loose, empty. A chill shot through my veins. My breath came in shallow gasps as my eyes darted around the room, searching for her. Then I felt it. A presence. Behind me, the hairs on my arms stood on end. I turned. Julia stood inches away, her body impossibly still, her head tilted in that unnerving way. Her pupils swallowed her irises, black voids reflecting the dim glow of the emergency lights. "Why are you afraid?" she whispered, voice layered with someone else. I backed up, but the room seemed smaller now. The walls seemed closer. Her lips twitched, then parted. "You brought them with you." My throat went dry. "Who?" Her face split into an inhuman grin. "You'll see." Then the lights went out, and the screaming started. The darkness swallowed everything. A suffocating, inky blackness that stretched beyond the limits of my senses. But the screaming, it didn't come from Julia. It didn't come from me. It came from everywhere. A chorus of tortured wails, voices layered and twisted, filled the room. Some shrieked in agony, others in rage. My chest tightened as my pulse thundered in my ears. My fingers fumbled along the wall, desperate to find the light switch, the door handle, anything. Then a flicker. A dim, flickering red light from the emergency exit sign outside the room's window illuminated the space in brief flashes. And that's when I saw them. Shadowy figures, dozens of them. Twisted, elongated, writhing against the walls, the ceiling, the floor. Their limbs twitched and contorted unnaturally. Their hollow eyes locked onto me, and in the middle of them stood Julia. Or what used to be her. Her body jerked violently, her head snapping back as if an invisible force was pulling at her from all directions. Her mouth opened, but the sound that came out was not human. It was a deep, guttural growl that vibrated through the air. My stomach lurched as I backed away. Then she lunged. Her body didn't move. It shifted, as if she was suddenly much closer than she should have been in the span of a heartbeat. Her face inches from mine, her lips curled into that awful grin. Then she spoke, but her lips didn't move. The words came from behind me, whispered directly into my ear. "You don't belong here." I spun around. Nothing. But when I turned back, Julia was gone. The figures on the walls convulsed violently before vanishing, one by one, leaving the room empty, silent. The overhead lights flickered back on. The door swung open on its own. I didn't hesitate. I ran. The hallway outside was eerily quiet. Nurses and doctors moved as if nothing had happened. The hospital buzzed with its usual late-night routine. Hadn't they heard the screaming? The voices? Didn't they see what was in that room? Dr. Carter stood at the nurse's station, pale and shaking. His eyes met mine, and he gave a slow, hesitant shake of his head. "I told you," he muttered. "You shouldn't have come." I swallowed the lump in my throat. "Where is she?" I demanded. He didn't answer. Instead, he just lifted a trembling hand and pointed toward the room I had just fled. The number on the door had changed. Room 326 was empty. No bed. No restraints. No sign that anyone had ever been there. And on the door, scrawled in deep, fresh red scratches, were 2 words. "Still here." I stood frozen, my breath hitching as I stared at the door. Room 326 was gone. The space where I had seen Julia, where I had heard the voices, was now just an empty storage closet. The scratches on the door, deep and fresh, glistened under the fluorescent lights. "Still here." A whisper curled around my ear. "Don't turn around." The air behind me shifted, cold, damp, pressing. Every nerve in my body screamed at me to run, but I couldn't move. A slow, deliberate breath rasped behind me. Too close, too real. Then fingertips grazed the back of my neck. I spun, hands raised, nothing. The hallway stretched before me, empty. A gurney sat abandoned near the nurse's station, a patient chart hanging loosely off the side. The hum of the overhead lights filled the silence. Dr. Carter was gone. The entire floor was wrong. Something shifted in the reflection of a nearby window. A shape, tall, gaunt, staring. I turned toward it, heart hammering. The glass rippled like a pool of water disturbed by something beneath the surface. And in the murky distortion, I saw them, dozens of them. Dark, sunken figures with hollow eyes, their mouths twisted in silent screams. They weren't standing in the hallway. They were watching from the reflections. One of them stepped forward, its fingers pressing against the glass from the inside. Its mouth moved, forming words I couldn't hear. Then the glass cracked. Thin fractures webbed across the surface, spreading faster than they should. The overhead lights flickered. The hum of the hospital grew distant, like a sound traveling through water. The crack in the glass widened, and I saw her. Julia. Her face pressed against the other side, her skin pale, eyes black voids. Then she smiled and whispered something. This time, I heard it. "You let them in." A shattering explosion. The glass erupted outward. Shards sliced through the air. I turned, shielding my face as the cold, stale air of whatever was on the other side spilled into the hall. The whispers turned to shrieks. A force slammed into me, knocking me backward. My vision blurred as I hit the floor. Then, silence. I opened my eyes. The hospital was normal again. The hallway intact. No broken glass, no figures. But something was different. The light was off. Too dim. The air heavy. And then I saw it. My reflection. It wasn't me. The figure in the glass, it was watching me. It looked like me, but its mouth was open, lips forming a soundless scream. And behind it, behind me, Julia, grinning. The lights went out, and I knew I was no longer in the hospital. The darkness pressed in around me, thick and suffocating. My heart pounded in my chest as I stood frozen in place, staring at the endless void. Then, a voice. Not Julia's, not the guttural whispers that had haunted me. This voice was soft, familiar, mine. I turned. The hospital room flickered into existence like a dying candle flame. Room 326. The bed was there, the monitors silent, the restraints hanging loosely. And in the bed, I was there, alive, breathing. I staggered forward, my pulse hammering in my ears. Was I dreaming? Was I dead? Then I saw her. Julia stood beside the bed, but she was different now. Her eyes were no longer bottomless voids. Her face was soft, human. The shadows that had clung to her like a second skin were gone. She smiled, not the cruel, twisted grin I had seen before, but something gentle. "You did it," she whispered. I shook my head. "Did what?" She stepped closer, reaching out. The moment her fingers touched my arm, warmth flooded through me. The crushing cold that had clung to my bones for so long vanished. "You broke the cycle," she said. "You didn't let them take you. You fought back." I swallowed hard. "I don't understand." Julia's smile didn't fade. "You weren't the doctor. You weren't the patient. You were the only one who could stop it." She gestured to the empty hospital room around us. "This place, it's been trapping people for decades. But you refused to stay lost in it." A strange, light feeling filled my chest. The fear, the terror, it was fading. Julia took a step back. Her form was beginning to blur, to dissolve into golden light. "It's time for you to go," she said softly. The walls around me began to glow. The shadows recoiled. And suddenly, I remembered. The real hospital, the real world. I had been trapped in something unnatural, something dark. But now, I was waking up. I reached for Julia, but she only smiled. "Don't worry about me. I was never meant to leave. But you still have a life waiting for you." The warmth spread through me, brighter, stronger. Then a voice, distant but real. "Doctor, doctor, can you hear me?" The golden light engulfed me, and when I opened my eyes, I was in a hospital bed. The real one. Doctors and nurses hovered around me, their faces filled with shock and relief. "He's back," someone whispered. I blinked against the harsh fluorescent lights, my heart hammering, the weight that had clung to me. The presence, the darkness, was gone. I turned my head slowly toward the corner of the room. There was no one there, but just before I closed my eyes, I swore I heard a soft whisper, Julia's voice. "You're safe now." And for the first time in what felt like forever, I believed it. The end.